In DC, for DC. DC Radio, 96.3 HD4 and DCRadio.gov.
Welcome back to another edition of Champagne and Credit right here on 96.3 HD4. My name is Muriel Garr. You know, being a woman has a lot of positives, but sometimes it could have negatives, particularly when you're thinking about being a woman in the workplace or even more in the financial industry. And as we're looking to move from struggle to prosperity, having a role model plays a key role in actually that ability to do that. Someone that you can look up to, someone that you know has traveled that road and can provide you not only guidance, but also can be that ambassador for you in the workplace and as you're looking to make financial decisions. So today I'm really honored to have with us in the studio a woman by the name of Kim Saunders, and Kim is going to introduce herself to us. She's done a lot of things in the financial sector, and currently she's actually the president of the National Bankers Association. Kim, welcome to Champagne and Credit.
Muriel, thank you. I'm honored and humbled to be here.
Well, let's just first start by introducing yourself to our audience. Tell them, who is Kim Saunders?
Well, I have been blessed to have had a many decade long career in the financial services industry. I was born right here in the district in Northeast DC. And when I was 3 years old, my family moved to the town of Glenarden, which is a historic African-American township. And so my mom is still there.
Wow.
And my dad passed in 2008 and buried in Arlington. But I'm back and forth between here and Durham, North Carolina, where I reside. So in terms of my career, when I was in high school, I was able to go to St. Catherine's School in Richmond, Virginia as a boarder. And then from there, went to Wharton School of Finance. At St. Catherine's was founded in the 1800s. It's a predominantly, at that time, white school, still is, all-girl Episcopalian school. And there I really had an opportunity, Muriel, to see the benefits of what they call old money in this country. And when you have a chance to see that up close and personal, for me, it made me realize that I wanted to dedicate my life to trying to provide more access to capital, more economic justice for more people in this country. And so that led me to study finance at Wharton, to have the opportunity. I was blessed to get an internship with Chase in New York, sophomore and junior year. Fell in love with banking. As we know, banking is the epicenter of the movement of money in this country and access to capital for us as a people. And so I pursued a commercial lending background. And then kind of fast forward in the span of 30 years, had an opportunity to go through credit training at Chase, to do workout at Chase, to do correspondent banking where you're lending to other banks at Chase, and then came here, worked for National Bank of Washington, 3 startup banks, one troubled bank turnaround as CEO, Consolidated Bank and Trust in Richmond, and then Mechanics and Farmers Bank, guiding him through the financial crisis that we endured in 2008. And then in 2014, after all of that sort of day-to-day running of banks and experience in banks, decided to focus on sector solutions, and am blessed now to serve as the CEO, as you mentioned, of National Bankers Association.
Wow. But, you know, the irony of all of these leadership roles that you've spoken to, you were able to step into those roles as a woman of color.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, you know, didn't really think so much about the notion of being a female. I mean, the roles have been blessed to be the second female CEO in the history of both Consolidated Bank and Trust and Mechanics and Farmers Bank, and now even the National Bankers Association. But I really didn't focus so much on the nature of gender as much as wherever I've been, it's my goal to pursue excellence and to do it in such a way that you're making a difference to the organization. And I, believe that if you stay focused on the work, your gift will make room for you.
That's really optimistic.
I'm an optimistic person, Muriel. When I went to Consolidated Bank and Trust, the bank was on the brink of failure. The regulators met me the first day in case they had to close the bank. The bank had been losing money for 6 years prior to my becoming CEO. So if I wasn't an optimistic person, I wouldn't have stepped into the helm of CEO of that bank. So I think you have to have goals and objectives. You have to try to develop a plan, but more than anything, and I'm a woman of faith, so I believe there's nothing too hard for God to do. And so, you got to stretch out on your faith, and then you got to have skills. You have to know that you know what you know, and then allow that to help you move forward in your career.
Well, you brought in that you're a woman of faith, but, I can sometimes be a woman of faith, but I think they'll probably question me when I get to the Golden Gates. But that said, faith requires people. And, I got to go back to the fact you're a woman and you're a woman of color. And you were bank president in times where, first of all, there weren't that many women in leadership roles, and even fewer women of color that were trusted to be a turnaround for a financial institution. So who were the types of people that you surrounded yourself with? Because, God works through people, because he's not just up there pushing buttons. He needs people to help do his work. So what was your circle like, the type of people that were around you?
So I appreciate that question. Again, I was fortunate to have some wonderful mentors. And I do recommend that people seek mentors in their career, male or female, no matter who you are. I think you need someone that you can go to when you need to make these career choices. And so I had wonderful and have wonderful mentors that at each turn I would seek their guidance and counsel so that I would know how to navigate various circumstances and career decisions. And I can say that they have not steered me wrong.
Okay. So you've went to Wharton B School, worked for Chase, one of the top, and still is one of the top financial institutions, turnaround for several banks. Now you're heading the National Bankers Association. First of all, for our listeners, who is the NBA?
So the National Bankers Association was founded in 1927 as the National Negro Bankers Association. And in 1948, we changed our name to the National Bankers Association. So this year we will celebrate our 93rd anniversary.
Wow.
And we are the trade association, the premier trade association for minority banks in the country. There are about 4,800, so slightly under 5,000 banks today in the country. Out of that number, about 148 are designated as minority banks. And that includes African American, Asian American, Native American, and Hispanic American banks. And so our trade associations is the leading advocacy organization for these banks in the country. And we also have programs and benefits to help improve the business models of those banks.
Now, when we say minority bank, what does that mean? What is a minority bank?
So the definition, the FDIC's definition of a minority bank, which is what we follow, are those banks which are owned by individuals of color and or some are actually publicly traded. And when you're publicly owned or traded, you are not able to always determine the ethnicity of your ownership. So if in fact your bank's board of directors and the communities you serve are predominantly minority, then you can also be designated a minority bank in this country.
So you said owned by minorities. Ownership of a bank requires a significant amount of capital.
Well, in some cases, I mean, some of our banks, for example, Mechanics and Farmers Bank was founded in 1907. Those men that founded that bank pulled together $10,000 of their own money to actually start the bank. So, yes, that represents millions of dollars today. But to own a share in a bank, especially if it's publicly traded, may not cost you as much as you think. So access to ownership is accessible if you are interested in that.
But we can also say, though, because when we think about, sometimes the storyline as it pertains to minorities, the limited amount of assets that they have, and the fact that they're always spenders, to say that minorities own banks actually paints a total different picture as it pertains to the access, not only the access of wealth, but the mindset around that wealth. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so I'm in total agreement with that. I really am encouraged, I guess, if you will, by the story of, I just attended the Treasury's Freedmen's Bank Forum. And the Freedmen's Bank was the first bank that African Americans used to pool their money together. It was established by the government after slavery so that we would have a safe place to place our money. And Muriel, I was astounded by the fact that if you look at the resources that these individuals put together, today, it would have represented over $115 billion of collective resources. So for me, we have been a people that know how to pull resources together and to do it in such a way that it is meaningful and can actually move the needle for our community. And so today, though, if you look at specifically African American owned banks, today we only have in our collective banks about $5 billion. So we got a lot of work to do.
But that's not $5 billion with a B. That's not small change.
It's not small change, but when you consider the fact that we are a $1 trillion economy, that's not even 0.5%.
Okay.
So we have room to grow and to do better. And then when you look at the collective, so as I mentioned, there are about 148 minority designated institutions in the country. Their aggregate asset base is slightly under $250 billion, and that's about the size of a BB&T prior to its merger with SunTrust to become Truist.
Okay. So we're large versus small. But, I mean, minority banks are similar. Well, are they? Would you say they're similar to community banks because of their overall mission and focus?
Yeah. So, when you look back and think about the definition of a community bank, these are typically smaller banks, but they also are closer to the community. They're on the ground. And so our banks, by mission and focus, many of them have the CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution designation. And that is a designation that is provided by the U.S. Treasury to those financial services providers that by mission are focused on providing financial services to communities of color, low to moderate income communities. And so many of our banks have that designation, which means their mission, their purpose is to serve those communities. And so they're not only community banks residing in the community, but they are over-delivering in their services and provision of access to capital to the communities that are most underbanked, underserved in our country. So I'm proud to serve in this role and to be able to support that part of our banking sector because they are doing the most and heaviest lifting of work as it comes to
changing our communities,
providing homes, financing small businesses.
Well, stop. You said financing small businesses. You know, one of the things that is often said about community banks, minority banks, and credit unions, I'm going to put them all in the same bucket, although that they are different, is that they don't provide the same suite of products and services that these large conglomerates or financial institutions provide, particularly small business products. But you've just said that these minority-owned institutions, I mean, my ears went up. You said small business.
Yeah, so we are providers of small business loans, SBA guaranteed loans. For example, during this coronavirus, Congress is looking at, and the president mentioned, utilizing the SBA as a way to make sure that small businesses will be able to survive this current pandemic. And our banks are providers of small business loans, and many of them offer the same online banking products and services that other banks offer. So if you are an individual in this country and you really want to bank in a way that would allow you to do good as well as do well, then I would just encourage you to consider, one of our banks.
Mission-focused banking.
Yes.
Wow. So what have you found are some of the greatest challenges when working with minority banks versus some of the greatest rewards?
I think the greatest challenge is the fact that you realize the unique potential that these institutions have. Again, because some of them, as I mentioned, are over 100 years old. They're serving multi-generational businesses and families. And when I look at the potential of the sector to really change the economic landscape of our country, but the challenge is the need for capital to be provided to the sector so they can do the work that only they are skilled to do. So I liken our sector to specialized sort of armed forces. As we know, many in our country have been left behind from an economic perspective. Mm-hmm. We say we're at full employment, but when you look at communities of color, they're not at full employment. And so there's an opportunity there to really change the paradigm. But it's going to take capital in our institutions so that they can scale up in the delivery of the resources and services that they're able to provide. So capital is a significant challenge.
And when we talk about capital,
yes,
what does that mean for the average consumer when we talk about capital?
So for the average consumer, I would just encourage them to consider becoming customers of our banks. And then as you become a customer, that's both the placement of your deposits as well as, even more importantly, considering becoming a loan customer if you're qualified to do so. Because the interest that you write, that interest income that you're providing is the income source for our banks. And so if, in fact, my mortgage is from a Black-owned bank, and I have a sense of pride when I pay my mortgage because I know that income is actually going into that institution of color, and then they're going to turn around and utilize those resources to employ people in our communities, to be able to provide loans in our community, and to recycle those dollars back into the community. So for the average consumer, they can consider where they're banking, both on the deposit side and the loan side, and be a supporter of these banks in our community.
What would you say when someone says, that sounds great, but it's very difficult to get a loan from a minority institution because their credit criteria greatly exceeds where I am in the credit space as far as my basic credit score?
So what I would say to them is that all banks are regulated by the FDIC, OCC, or Federal Reserve. And all banks have to follow certain guidelines in providing loans. We're not nonprofits. We're not charitable organizations. And so I think sometimes the expectation is that we can just give a grant. And
you mean a loan that doesn't get paid back?
A loan that doesn't get paid back. Or, I remind people when regulators come in to do their examinations, they pull files, they look at documentation. They don't talk to us and say, is this a good person? The file has to speak for itself. So you have to be able to evidence that you can pay the loan back. We have to show that we have done the proper review and examination of that particular customer and their capacity to repay. And all of that has to be documented thoroughly.
And capacity meaning that they have a job or income source,
yes,
that they can meet those monthly payments.
That is exactly correct.
Not that it's going to be coming from a tree somewhere.
No, we have to show, and all banks have to show that. So we all have criteria. And then the other thing I remind people is about banking is that the bank's source of cash to be provided in the form of loans to people are your deposits. And so I always ask them, now when you coming into, and I'm a former commercial lender, so I grew up on the lending side. And so when I talk in the community and with people about lending and try to remove the mystery of it, I always ask them, now, would you give yourself this loan?
Ooh.
Have you asked yourself the typical questions? And it's amazing to me how no matter where I go, when we have this conversation, everyone comes up with the right questions. What do you need the money for? How are you going to pay me back? How do I know you're going to pay me back? Tell me how long you've been working. How much money are you making?
Exactly.
I mean, so lending is very much a common sense process. And if you can clear your own hurdles, more than likely you'll be fine with the bank.
So it doesn't matter whether it's a majority bank or a minority bank. The criteria really is the same.
It is the same. And then, a lot of times I would say it's not always, it should be an even playing field, but it's not always an even playing field. And by that, I go back to, sometimes the community has the expectation that we should just give the money. And so sometimes the criticism that you hear or the disappointment that you hear may come from individuals and businesses who weren't quite ready. But what I would say is that our banks are very careful to not just say no, but to do we provide a lot of technical assistance and hand holding. It's our pleasure to do that. That's part of our purpose and mission, is to talk to you about, if you're not ready, how do you get ready for your loan?
And you're able to do that because you're closer to the ground.
Absolutely.
And I would assume because you really know your client base, they're just not a number. You know, oh, that's Muriel, and Muriel has 2 children, and I know where Muriel went to school, and so you can have a real conversation. So you've established a relationship. So it really feels like a partnership, right?
Our relationships are deep. Our relationships are almost like family. We typically know our customers by voice. It's very personal for us, and as I said, some of our banks have served the same families for years. And even one of our banks, our local bank here, Industrial Bank, the CEO is the 3rd generation, which is so powerful. His grandfather started that bank. They are still right there on U Street serving the community. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful success story.
So you took the helm of MBA, 2 years ago?
In 2018, and I have been on the board since 2013.
So what's your vision for MBA?
So our vision really is to provide both the legislative, regulatory, and business support so that our sector will thrive.
Okay.
So we have a legislative agenda, we have a regulatory agenda, and then we have a programmatic agenda so that we're delivering a holistic approach to actually helping minority banks in the country to not only survive, but to thrive and have the resources to really continue to grow. And so on a legislative front, there's an MDI bill that is in process now that we
Minority Deposit Institution.
Yes, I'm sorry
for
the acronym.
No, keep going.
Minority Depository Institutions, MDI, minority banks, in other words, bill that's in process. On the regulatory side, all of the regulatory agencies have a stated commitment to promoting and preserving minority banks in the country. That's also part of their requirements. And so we are working with them as they seek to support the sector. The Treasury has a wonderful mentor protege program that's in process now to really help our banks become more engaged in doing business with the federal government. So we are working with them on that. And then on the programmatic side, we have a number of corporate partners and business partners, such as the large banks and other large companies that are working with our sector to help it grow.
So if a listener wants to find out where a minority bank is in their community. You spoke about Industrial Bank and the Doyle Mitchell family, et cetera. But where could they go to find out where a minority bank is? Because we have listeners throughout the United States. So where could they go to find out where a minority bank is in their community? Yeah,
so the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, produces on a quarterly basis a list of all of the minority banks in the country. In addition to that, those that are members of the National Bankers Association, you can go to our website. Our member listing is there. And then when you click, and it's by state, and so when you click on that particular member's name, it will lead you to their website, and you would be able to learn even more about their products and services. So those are 2 places that you can go to learn more about minority banks
and minority banks have the same, so your money is insured.
Your money is insured just like any other bank, and again, the services that we provide are just like any other bank.
So FDIC.gov, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and National Bankers Association.org, those 2 sites. So you've got a minute and a half left, and I always give my guests an opportunity for their 30-second commercial. What is your charge to our listeners today?
My charge to your listeners is that they do take a moment to do the research on our banks and the sector, and that they, I feel, will be greatly rewarded by the opportunity of doing business with them, and that opportunity will render them the ability to do well and do good, all at the same time.
Because you did talk about Freedmen's Bank. And Freedmen's Bank, I've studied Freedmen's Bank. I mean, they had churches that were depositors. They had colleges and universities. They had businesses. They had individuals. They had trusts. And so when we think about our minority banks, we need to think holistically about how we can invest and spend our money to better the things that are important to us. Well, Kim, I really thank you for joining me today. You are a phenomenal woman. I have looked up to you for years as I've tried to climb that ladder and create change. And I congratulate you on what you're doing and look forward to you doing greater things in the future.
Likewise, Muriel. Thank you.
You've been listening to Champagne and Credit, Pathway to the Middle Class, right here on dcradio.gov at 96.3 HD4. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
In DC, for DC, DC Radio, 96.3 HD4, and dcradio.gov.